And Paul, do you want that picture from Turkey up?
Oh, yes, if it's handy, that would be great.
Here.
There we go. So I just got back a couple weeks ago from Turkey. I spent 3 weeks there working with an organization called All Hands and Hearts, which is a disaster relief organization. We tried to get in and be able to do some building safety evaluations and see if we could get the local authorities to allow us to do that on a larger basis. That didn't happen, but we did do some informal building safety evaluations. But to set the scene, we were in Kahramanmaraş, and a city of about 500,000 people. After the earthquake, about 100,000 people left to live in other parts of the country, live with family. About 100,000 people were living in tents. So you can imagine that every open space, every flat space, everywhere across the city, there were tents set up where people were living. I don't recall how many people died in the city, but I know it was well over 5,000. So about 1% of the population died during the earthquake. And it wasn't just one, it was actually 2 earthquakes. Both were rated on the scale, it was
70 something.
yes, but the numbers, violent, extreme, violent and extreme shaking. To give a sense of that, one of the people I did an assessment for, he said that there was a jar of tomato sauce on the shelf on one side of the room, and during the earthquake it flew across the room and hit the wall on the other side. So huge efforts, huge amount of shaking. So just to give you an idea how scary that would have been. There were a lot of people who had basically PTSD. They did not want to go back into their buildings, whether they were safe or not, because they had lived through that. But one of the big issues was the tagging of the buildings. There wasn't anything. The federal government was going through and doing building safety evaluations, spending about 10 minutes a building, and then putting up barcodes, gluing barcodes to the building, but not telling anyone what it meant or what it was for, and you couldn't go and get that information from the local government. And so that, one of the things we teach is that whatever you're posting, it has to be clear, it has to be readable to the people so they know whether they can occupy the building or not. And in Turkey, that is not the case. And recovery, the first step to recovery is getting people back into their safe buildings. And so between the fear and the lack of transparency from the government, people were, 100,000 people were staying in tents. This was 3 months after the earthquake. So I thought that would be something useful for you to understand. This is a picture of a school that I did an evaluation of. It was surrounded by a displaced people's camp of about 4,000 people. You can see the style of construction here. It's actually reinforced concrete framing, and then in between the rooms there's cinder blocks. These are lightweight cinder blocks that just fill the spaces between the framing. It would be like these panel doors here just being filled with cinder block. So the only damage I found in that building was where the cinder blocks were falling out of the walls. But since there was the government said you can't go in there, but actually the level of effort to make that building habitable would have been very easy, because they could have removed the debris, cleaned it up, and then just braced these infill walls to keep them from falling out of plane. And it would have been a fully occupational school with 36 classrooms, yet none of that was happening because of the lack of transparency. But that's just kind of a quick summary of what was going on. Any questions or?
Paul, I talked to somebody who is working with what used to be OFTA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and he was in Turkey doing shelter and settlements, and he mentioned that one of the big pillars is always things like non-structural mitigation. Not even structural, but like just not hooking your stuff to the wall or bookcases that fall over. That maybe it was a really high percentage, maybe of the people that died, 10 or 15% is from non-structural mitigation, things that we could really all do. I just wondered if
And
you
you
saw
could, yeah, no, that's, well, and this is a good example of that, where, and this style of construction is 90% of the buildings, even 2 stories tall, use this style of construction. You probably read about there was concerns that there was corruption, that buildings were not being built to the plans weren't being designed to the code. Just my observation was that the buildings that you could see collapse were generally older than their modern seismic codes, which was about the year 2000, and they were brittle, the concrete not properly reinforced to our seismic standards, but they were older buildings that had collapsed. Then the other thing is then a lot of the newer buildings, you might see damage like this that could kill somebody. A cinder block is lightweight, but you get several falling, it'll kill you. But the buildings themselves either were slightly damaged and did their job because we design buildings to not fail as opposed to being usable afterwards. And so there were quite a few buildings that were not occupiable, newer buildings, because they did their job. They didn't collapse, but they might have had, again, a fair amount of non-structural damage like this that could hurt somebody. So that was another impression I had there.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Okay, Hannah, back up. As I mentioned, John is going to need to, John, do you want to sit in? Why don't you sit here? And then I guess we can turn this screen on. Okay. So are there any burning questions from the crowd before we read the ones that came?
Well, I'm just going to follow up on what Paul said now and getting back to a comment from earlier about this question about placarding and the question about only, and this was in Puerto Rico, I think, of only putting up the red placards but not the green or yellows. And I guess the question in terms of that particular practice is, part of the role of the placarding is as a public-facing communication. It's not just for the data collection for the sake of the government tracking what they've done, but so much of it is communicating outward to the owners, the residents, and the general community, the state of all of these buildings and where they are. And if you're only spray painting a color on a gate post, how well are you actually sharing what's going on with the community that way? Was there any question about that in terms of how the policy decision was for how that was done?
Most of the ones, when we decided that that's how we were going to move forward, there was you've limited resources. The numbers of buildings are high. You don't have a lot of people that are displaced. The buildings are quite simple, and filling out the placard was not something we were getting much traction on. yet we had to record it. And I thought, all in all, we ended up in a better place, sort of, instead of fighting that issue and trying to change everybody and get that thing done to move on. You got to remember, sometimes you're a guest in somebody else's location, and you just got to kind of move on, and you have to read that environment correctly. If you have a lot of assets and you got plenty of placards and you got the time and you got the horsepower to do that, it's not a downside. But most of the buildings you're going to look at are not going to be damaged, or there's going to be minimal amount of damage. The ones that are seriously damaged, you're not putting people in regardless whether there's a red placard or not.
And
But we did red placard them. Go ahead.
And what did you do in Superstorm Sandy? Did you
Placard.
placard?
Yeah.
Okay, and let's hear what Alaska, did you guys placard?
We did. We put greens, yellows, and reds on it. In hindsight, I think it really comes down to the situation that you're dealing with. If 99% of your buildings aren't damaged, you're just burning up resources putting green placards on them. Yeah, I just, and with my limited resources, is that let's just focus on the damage, because again, your objective is to find the hang fire. You know, it wasn't so much to survey what had happened.
Well, I would also imagine, and I've imagined, because I haven't worked in that capacity, but I've often thought the yellow, to me, is the one that's got the most complexity to it, where the green and red are pretty binary in ultimately what they're saying, but the conditions that are applied to whatever's going on with are restricted, but not closed, open one is the one that has the most requirements for what you're actually communicating.
Yeah.
I can address that a little bit. The yellow to red situation, where you have something that's likely, the way I trained our guys, where if it was likely to go to red after a yellow, you might bite the bullet and go for the red. Because if you have an aftershock or you have an after event, you're going to end up in red, and then you're back where you started. And I think sometimes by allowing people to go reoccupy, I always thought, no matter what job I did in DOB, anytime that you had people that you took out and then you put them back in, you had to take them back out, it was more damaging than taking them out at the beginning and leaving them out till you get time to assess. And anything that I thought was in bad enough shape that it should have been red or it might go to red, we jumped the gun and said, okay, migrate it to red. We can always revisit it afterwards. But putting people back in and then having them come back out turned out to be a nightmare, because everybody said they should have been out to start with.
Do you mean having the residents leave and come back? Is that what you're talking about?
We had that numerously, where we had something that was marginal, that was really occupiable, but most of it was really not occupiable, but an aftershock would have made it go worse. I said, pull the trigger and go for the red, keep them out till we have time to reevaluate this situation, putting them back in, and then having a dangerous event happen with an aftershock. And we had that in Puerto Rico. And I said, try and avoid those yellows unless they're really quite good, and that the homeowner can get some assets in there, clear an exit or something like that.
What happens?
I have a question about the paint. Had inspectors before, like, will staple notices on a door, damages the door. Is there any sort of issue with spray painting a door, or, especially if it's green? If they're good to move in, probably maybe want to consider that. I don't know.
Yeah, we usually we didn't paint the door, and we didn't put it on the entrance. We usually put it on the gate post so we could see it from the street.
What happens if you did, when it did happen, when you moved people out and you just gave them a yellow placard and they came back in and the house was destroyed? Can the residents come after you guys for labeling it as yellow instead of red? What happens afterwards in terms of
I mean, is
financial
there
costs?
any liability
Yes.
if they make a mistake?
Yes.
Is there any liability? I think that we just talked about the Good Samaritan laws, right?
That's where you need your lawyer building.
Your lawyer building.
We never had a recurring lawsuit from 66,000 buildings in Sandy. The only time that we had challenges was usually when people were trying to do an insurance claim. What they did is they fought to get the report out of us. Or we had homeowners fight for a red because they wanted to be out of the building and us to do the damage assessment so they could ditch the mortgage. They wanted our assessment, or alternately they wanted to go back in because they had some issue with the mortgage. It was rarely to do with the condition that was wrong.
I think most states have strong tort laws that protect municipal workers that are doing their job, right? You have to be acting grossly negligent or whatever as a municipal worker to expose yourself to liability.
And Oregon has that same thing as a jurisdictional. It has to be malice. As long as you're not acting in malice, you're pretty much covered.
Yeah, and the point of the SAP, the Callaway SAP program, and if you guys know more about this than I do, my understanding is that the SAP program extends that liability coverage to not just the employees of the city that are inspectors, but also the people who are coming to the city and acting as mutual aid inspectors. So that's like the big value of that program, is it? And then what makes it really easy to trade inspectors.
Another question. So have any of you used drones or had staff who've used drones in the course of your damage assessments? And if so, could you talk about that? Or if not, do you see a potential for that in the future?
Yeah, especially for windshield survey.
We've used drones. We've used drones the last couple. Some municipalities prohibit drones because they're line of sight and they can be dangerous if they're not. It's not for now, but we've had people killed by drones in New York, especially in park environments.
But is the issue that the user doesn't know how to work the drone? I think the issue in Portland is about privacy, not about that the person using it doesn't know what they're doing.
If we have an emergent condition, we want to go in and see something, we can't get in, we use a drone to invoke the powers for it.
And just to clarify, you said their line of sight. You're saying, what my understanding of drone operations is the operator has to be able to see the drone at all times, right? And so like, when it comes to like scanning a big city for damage, it's like
Either that
limited
or
usefulness.
you have a spotter.
Geographic.
There's ways around that. So we have 2 inspectors, both of them are licensed FAA drone pilots. So that allows us as a government entity to be able to fly, especially in an emergency type of situation. So having somebody that's trained, who knows how a building goes together or comes apart, could be a really valuable tool, I think, in terms of doing a very rapid assessment, especially where you have a lot of debris or other types of issues. There could be an inspector safety issue.
Yep, we've used drones for that reason.
Or flat tires, yes.
I think in the city of Portland, I don't think we can use drones, but they usually contract out, maybe the police or fire, because I know in some of the recent fires, they've used drones to see what the situation is, right? But it's usually maybe fire department that gets somebody to do that, so, do you know anything about that?
They can use drones if they're licensed, if they pass their FAA 107. Said no.
So we always have to contract with somebody else. But there is an RDPO project, Carol, you might be able to speak more to this. There was an RDO project that was run out of Scappoose that, about drones and the use of them for fire. It was in the fire.
I have very rudimentary knowledge of that particular project, but I know they were trying to come up with some sort of like a training program or an approval type process that would apply across the region as opposed to every individual jurisdiction having to come up with their own.
Yeah.
I think it's
For damage assessment?
It wasn't about buildings.
yeah, it wasn't specific for damage assessment. I think it was just in general. Like,
It was to
response
use
operations.
drones to, learn more about whatever it was.
I know police is working on getting some drones. I think the last time I remember there was some money allocated to it, but I know they use it specifically for crashes because the drone allows them to better map the site of the crash instead of doing it all by ground and then causing major traffic backups. The amount of time utilized to, have officers on ground is minimized when you have a drone in the air, and then it can do all the mapping and everything. So I know we have that capability, but I don't know exactly to the extent of how often it's used and how much money it's
There's the-
funneling towards it.
There's the technical capability, which I think people have. It sounds like you have in Wilsonville. I know they have in Scappoose and we have in the area. And then there's the legal ability, and I think that's where the city doesn't. I don't think do it. On it?
Yeah, I was just talking to our fire guys this morning about using drones for the fire yesterday that was there in the building. And they were saying they don't have any drones to use, and they had to, they would borrow it from ATF.
They what?
They would borrow it from ATF.
Yeah,
to
so
use
they
the
do
drone.
use them sometimes, but we in the city don't own any, so you always have to go out
Yeah.
to somebody. Get it. Do any other city, you're Wilsonville, right?
We have two of them.
Do any other cities have?
Clark County has two, and they're using them quite actively, but that's all for building inspection. I haven't heard of them using them.
Happy Valley.
Happy Valley.
Clark County does use them for
Yes.
building inspections?
Yes.
Really?
Retro uses them for GIS mapping.
They're around.
And I think Washington State has a program focused on like disaster, drones and disaster response. I kind of forgot the whole project. Not kind of related to drones.
Yeah, I know I had seen some of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute work from some past earthquakes where they were using drones for actually LiDAR mapping. And it's a way to quickly evaluate like debris volumes. Things like that, there's a lot of opportunities, not just strictly visual.
Other questions, Amit?
Yeah, so I had a question about re-inspection. So once you have gone through and done inspections of the, post-disaster and tagged buildings, and then you get an aftershock. So is there like a threshold, or what do you use to say, okay, I have to go out and do re-inspections again? And what in Alaska did you have encountered anything like that when you get all these aftershocks?
So the biggest aftershock we got was 6 minutes after the earthquake. So that was a non-issue. And we never did get an aftershock so big that we felt like we needed to go back and look at things we'd already looked at. As I mentioned earlier, there was a couple of commercial buildings that had where the roof diaphragm was separated from the exterior CMU walls. Those were already red tagged though. So, but I mean that's the type of situation that really scares you with the aftershocks, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And like Tim was saying, any building that we thought was going to have the potential to collapse in an aftershock, that's a red tag. So, I think in that sense, it sorted itself.
We never had the opportunity of revisiting the job that we've all seen once, no matter where I went.
But even in the city of New York?
Yeah. The only ones we ever did was Sandy. We did 2 inspections on Sandy. And it was probably, in today's environment, they wouldn't require it again. You try and get it initially. If it was a storm event, the second event storm happened 6 hours after the first. And when we were in Puerto Rico for the earthquake, the aftershocks are tremors, but they're rarely to the magnitude of the initial. And we already anticipated the worst condition, and that was the policy, at least I set with our guys. If you think this thing is going to, get away from us on the second aftershock or an aftershock, we're attacking immediately. Because it's likely that thing's going to crop up, and we're going to be back in there again, people occupying the buildings. I've never asked to do a re-inspection. Municipalities didn't have the assets. They hardly had the assets to get to the initial inspection, but a re-inspection program was really on the burden that was the owners.
I was just going to say, I know there was a case that I'd read about in New Zealand about them setting up
Incubator
these
buildings.
case study buildings based on their building type and reevaluating each one after the aftershock to say, well, we know this building is starting to have fatigue or failing, and it would give them insight into how to judge their other, aftershock inspections. But that might be really based on the scale and size of the earthquake and the scale of the aftershocks. And sometimes the sequencing earthquakes like the one I went to in Italy, where you've got regional earthquakes going on, as opposed to a main shock and then a declining amount of aftershocks, that those would all come into play for what that's practical.
Yes, I think New Zealand did a lot of work on that indicator building, and that, we've been thinking about that, of how we would do it, that the aftershock would be at X magnitude, and then you'd have, look at your building types and figure out, I'll go look at this one, and if this one's damaged, the others. Yeah.
I had it sort of changed the topic question, and this isn't to do with on the ground immediately after a disaster, but I'm curious if any of you have had communications with insurance companies or proactively communicate with insurance companies, and whether they're, I don't want to pretend like there's logic in that world, but is there any sort of initiative or support for proactively addressing vulnerable structures, or encouraging or incentivizing proper preparation of structures in anticipation of an event, rather than always involving insurance companies and expecting them to come in after the event to address the issues?
Do you mean, has anybody worked with insurance companies proactively to get them to incentivize their clients to do so?
Them, or to work with them, or just to get resources from them, or connect with the folks that they insure, or to identify structures they're already insuring that maybe they have inventories of. They seem like a resource that ultimately, I imagine they lose a lot of money in the end game by like having to pay out when things happen, but you know, they run the risk game of taking the money in anticipation of the event being unlikely. When the event does happen, yes, it's unlikely, but when it does happen, they're the ones who ultimately financially really lose, unless the government comes back and bails them out after the event itself. So from a matter of like self-preservation, it feels like there would be an opportunity, or they might have community organizations or foundations that do work proactively in their own self-interest, but regardless could still be helpful for the public.
So I'm stretching the limits of what I know, because I'm not super familiar with the California Earthquake Authority, but the California Earthquake Authority manages earthquake insurance in California, and they also manage a lot of like homeowner simple retrofit programs. So like Brace and Bolt was one where like they gave homeowners small grants to do cover wall reinforcement, and they are now piloting a single family soft story or like living space over garage programs. It's like a similar concept where they're just like shelling out tons of smallish grants to homeowners of single family homes to do these. Yeah, so that's the only example I know of.
I could see how it could be in the homeowner's best interest to have a pre-inspection by an insurance agent, so there wouldn't be a claim by insurance to say, oh, that crack was already there, and therefore they've denied you a claim. It seems like I remember in Hurricane Sandy there was a Frontline episode or something about a number of insurance fraud cases that came out of that, because the insurance companies were denying claims based on a systematic way of saying these foundations were already damaged before the flooding occurred, and that was a problem. So I'm just thinking, what would be a beneficial role for the insurance agencies ahead of time in working with homeowners as a way of doing business that helps either expedite or offset a lot of their work afterwards. Re-inspections might be a way of doing that.
We teamed with insurance companies in the city to use them. We leveraged the actuarial tables and stuff like that after Sandy, but it was a complicated situation. The information was proprietary. The insurance companies came to the table because there were so many claims and we were part of their business and they were part of ours. So we did get some technical information from them. It was mostly data, it was not opinion-based data. And I forgot really what we did with that. There was a lot of claims denied about the foundation damage. A lot of insurance policies exclude foundation damage, so that was the big issue for us. And it migrated into other trades. It was like underpinning, that was the problem. So we tackled that with insurance companies, but the insurance companies, they were selective about sharing the information. It was hard gain for them. They weren't willing to give it out for nothing and stuff like that.
Darren, are there other questions from the floor? Do you have a?
I can go for a few. This is for Ross. What is the age of the water and sewer infrastructure in Anchorage, and how did it perform?
Oh, goodness, I couldn't give you the age. It predates me.
And that's 26 years in the city? Did you say?
Yeah, 26 for the city. I've been in Alaska 33 years. Klutna Lake, I think Anchorage was mostly well water until Klutna Lake came online. And I think Klutna came online in the 80s. So that's the municipal water supply. And it performed well. I don't think there were hardly any breaks in the water supply from the earthquake. There were some gas line breaks. The Enstar Natural Gas was scrambling, shutting gas off. There were a few fires that day, not many. And then the sewer system, I think, performed pretty well too.
The next one is, I think, for Tim and maybe some others can chime in as well. You mentioned that you decided houses that were red tagged were going to be demolished. How did homeowners react? Did they fight the decision? Did their insurance companies, how did they react?
The buildings that we red tagged for demolition were buildings that had been moved off their foundation and required, and there was no insurance policies. So we risk analyzed them regarding was the homeowner in a position to fix them themselves, or is it likely that this thing's going to get repaired? They were minimum standard buildings generally, and the biggest lift was who was paying for the demolition. And there was programs afterwards to help homeowners rebuild a lot of their buildings. So there was a lot of reconstruction with grant programs afterwards. So that lessened the blow. How did they react? It was rough going to tell them that this is not going to, and we did it quickly, and we bring them in, shared the news with them, tell them, this is what we need, this is likely to happen. And very few of them were in a position to fund repairs or repair the buildings. If I had one or two out of 550, that's as many as we were able to. Only in the more affluent areas where homeowners are able to sort of contemplate leaving the building there, getting an insurance claim, repaired. And, but generally the sort of the more marginalized areas, they were demolitions. And the conversations were ghastly. That's why we had the mental health people with us. I needed mental health every day telling these guys are going to take their building down. It was not good. But you had to bite the bullet and get on with it. It was in the interest of public. They had kids and stuff like that. It was like nuts.
Tim, when you're red tagging a house, how would you know that it doesn't have insurance?
These are evaluations that we did afterwards.
Okay, all right, so it's secondary.
Correct. We'd have to bring them in and ask them. We interviewed everybody, and we got in touch with everybody, brought them in for interviews, and sort of did the size up right there and then. And they said, well, we have insurance, we're likely to take care of it ourselves. Okay, we gave them like a few weeks to get it organized. We didn't give them a lot of time makes a bad situation better for people who want to stretch out a bad situation, see if they can get an insurance claim, and then leave the municipal government to pick up everything else. We had that where people claimed, and then they left town. And then there was a building that we were stuck with on our hands. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to move them so fast.
So Tim, I just am trying to figure out how this worked logistically. Did you have offices all over the city, or was somebody traveling 2 hours through Manhattan to come here, you tell them their building was in?
We had offices, and I had people deployed to different offices.
So field offices, so nobody was going too far from their home.
We had probably, well, it was mostly Staten Island and Queens and out of Brooklyn. So they were all clustered in a couple of areas.
And you had in your permitting system or whatever system that this was a red tag and then called them in?
Correct.
Question about you mentioned about the, I know there's individual systems with FEMA, right? to get money to recoup for claims and whatnot. How quickly or what kind of documentation needed to be provided so homeowners could get that individual assistance to repair their homes, especially for the yellow tag? I mean, were the houses that needed to get red tagged demolished quickly, or were they kind of stalled until homeowners can talk to FEMA again about getting assistance and documentation, so that way everything was kind of, was able to be reviewed by FEMA to say, hey, this makes sense? Because I know there's two different systems, right? With building assessments, FEMA does their own type of assessment, and then it seems like everybody has their own type of assessment. How much do they conflict or align, so that way it helps the homeowners getting money back?
My experience with FEMA was that they initially cut a 30 grand check, anywhere from 15 to 30 grand. They did it fast from homeowners, but it was only a stopgap measure. They did not pay for the demolition, but they did. It was different funds for reconstruction. New York City paid for the demolition of all of those houses that we're talking about, 550 houses, and the demolitions were done within 8 weeks.
Within how long?
8 weeks. I don't remember FEMA weighing in any meaningful way on the city's ability to move unsafe properties, but they were immensely helpful to fund hardship for homeowners promptly, and the restoration program took years. I'm still working on them. We're talking minimum a year to get in at the building for restoration, and probably 2 to 3 years to see if we can get it topped out and finished.
And Ross, did FEMA come into Alaska?
Yes.
They did? And what was their process? Did you have any buildings that had to be demolished?
Well, there were buildings that had to be demolished, but they were so badly damaged that the municipality didn't have to, force the point on that. And really, FEMA just kind of did their thing and we did our thing. We weren't really coordinating.
That's my experience.
The FEMA's public assistance program does have a provision for covering home demolitions if they meet a certain criteria, and so the county or the city, whichever, can get reimbursed for the cost of doing that. They may have worked out an arrangement, if you've got a lot of those to do, that could have been something that was factored in terms of how that was managed after that, in terms of the community bearing the cost of doing the demolitions, but they're getting reimbursed 75% by FEMA.
If there was an insurance claim, I remember FEMA didn't touch it.
Yeah, the insurance claim, of course, is what they want to see first.
Are there any other burning questions? So I think. Okay, Matt.
So I think you mentioned deputizing people when they come into your jurisdiction. Deputizing
Yes.
people when they come in. What does that look like? Like we were talking with the Oregon plan, we don't have a way to deploy people, so they would have to come to a jurisdiction and be deputized. What does that look like?
It was an executive order, mayoral executive order. I mentioned it in one of the presentations. We had executive orders ready to go from the mayor or from the governor, and it was a standardized sheet, and then the city official would deputize out of town.
And it's just a form, they fill out all their information, they sign it.
Is it like a religious ceremony where everybody puts their hands up?
Yeah.
Or is it like, really, seriously, is it just a piece of paper?
It was a piece of
Yeah.
paper.
But it's not a piece of paper that applies to each individual, you just are deputizing a whole group of people?
Well, everybody would have a sheet when we would go with them. It would be given to the municipal employee that they were adjourned that with us. We always went with a municipal employee and they would have the deputizing sheet. It's just it's like a contractor working with the city. But we wouldn't go unannounced without a municipal employee.
Wait, you're talking about being in Puerto Rico, you go with a Puerto Rican San Juan Municipal Authority,
Correct.
they have a deputization sheet, and so you are authorized to do
Correct.
what you do?
And we had it in New York City for out-of-town engineers that were assisting. we always had a New York City representative with them. You're never unaccompanied by a municipal. That's very important.
I have one other question. You keep saying engineers for when you're talking about New York. Did you only have structural engineers going out and doing that, or did you have inspectors, plans examiners, and other?
Inspectors, plan examiners, architects, the whole gamut of building professionals.
Okay.
And I will add that the changes that happened, as Eric reminded me, in the code because of what some ORSs are, they took out some sections in chapter 1. If you read the FEMA P 2055, it references those as how you get your authority to deputize. Those may not be in the OSSC right now. So that's where OrSAP needs to work with the governor, and when they have a declaration from the governor's office, it needs to include things like that so that we have authorization to do all the stuff that needs to be done. And that's still on the list of things to coordinate with OrSAP.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a gap there.
Hopefully we can get Jonah and Kristen to talk and they can start working on something. Yeah, there's a gap. So.
Okay, thank you.
On that note, jurisdictions, individual municipalities, they have their own city code that they have, and that's already been approved by the state, which allows the building official to appoint and you can authorize anybody. And in that scenario, an emergency scenario, they wouldn't even have to have an Oregon cert. So I don't agree with that portion, but that still would allow somebody that's duly qualified, for instance, maybe it's in Washington, SE, it's down there, he's not licensed in Oregon. Would he be qualified to be able to determine if that's a good thing in an emergency situation as a building official?
I
Absolutely.
guess it'd be up to the building official to deal with that after the fact. The other problem is we talk to Osbeals and they still want us to work out how we get, because we said, well, look, a Washington engineer should be able to do this. And they're like, oh, well, we think there's too many words, we gotta fix this. So then that's another thing on our list. We have a long list.
Well, but I think if it is at your local level, if you've adopted something that you're able to do that, that's, you know, but you could only do it within your city.
Right, it even allows the city manager to go and do that stuff too, and I don't want him out there.
Well, I'm just curious in Oregon here, because the original laws were through state building codes. When they managed this program, and there were laws about dangerous buildings and post-earthquake inspections, but now state building codes is not doing it. Fire marshal's office is doing it through statute, but the people who are doing the work are building code officials who report back to state building codes. So I'm just wondering where the line of authority is for this program being managed through the fire marshal's office, but is being through local building officials who don't report to the fire marshal, they report to state building codes.
And to
Does that
even
make
make
sense?
it more complicated, OEM has to be involved to be able to reach out for more services. So there's 3 groups, and that's what I'm really hoping that we can talk afterwards. The coordination needs to happen.
What have I done?
So, yeah, that's an issue, and we need to get that worked out. Currently, the training that we're doing for OrSAP has some slides that show here's theoretically how it might work right now, but we're still trying to figure this out because, especially when we present it to BOs, you guys tell us what were the problems so we can take this back to OrSAP and say we've got to hash this out because this doesn't really, what we've got shown doesn't really work yet. It's just in theory, sort of what we think is the best we can do with what the laws are now or what people are agreeing to do and who's playing ball. So, yeah, I'll just send you in some of the slides and you can get back to us with comments and we can figure out where to go.
Okay, that's all the burn? No more burning questions? Is there anything else in the thing that you feel like needs to be asked?
I do have a few more, but I think you've covered some of the areas fairly well.
Last words to our wonderful panelists, speakers? Okay. You are free to go.